All right, everybody. So we have Gabrielle Fundaro with us today. She has a PhD in skeletal muscle physiology and biochemistry, and you focus kind of on the role of gut health, right, and how that affects metabolism.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And she also works for Renaissance Periodization. And what do you do there?
I'm a nutrition consultant there. So primarily, I've got a couple people that I've done, training with as well, but primarily nutrition for anyone from just recreational exercisers to people who are competitive athletes.
Awesome. And today you said the charity you wanted my donation to go towards would be Fur Kids. So could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so Fur Kids is located here in Atlanta, and it runs like really a huge system of no-kill animal shelters and also helps cats with FIV. So I myself have 3 rescue dogs and 2 rescue cats. So I just really love animals, and I love helping the community, especially with a no-kill shelter, because that is a huge commitment, to helping those animals for the duration of their lives, and especially, animals that come in with old age or chronic disease and things like that. Oftentimes they're going to be euthanized, and, this just really gives them a chance at a really good life.
Awesome. Yeah, we actually just had Dr. Scott Stevenson also suggested an animal shelter, so I think it's great. And you have an MMA background, right, or some fighting background?
I had a short stint doing some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. That was back in 2014.
Okay.
And I did a competition. It was a lot of fun, and I trained super, super hard for probably about 8 months. But I kept dislocating my shoulder. So I have hypermobility in both. I have hypermobility, and so like both shoulders are just kind of like held together by wet spaghetti noodles. So I was like, I can't lift if I'm recovering from shoulder dislocation. And then the strength coach that I was working with was like, you should really do bodybuilding, like just try it. And so after that, I transitioned and did a women's physique for a while there, and then took some time off, and then switched over to powerlifting. So I like to just spend a little time with everything.
Did you catch the fight this past weekend?
I didn't, but I got the recap.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was pretty excited to hear that. I mean, I don't want, no hate on McGregor fans or whatnot, but like, I watched both of his fights with Nate Diaz, and so I'm more of a whoever is fighting Conor, like, more of his fan. But yeah, it's pretty interesting to see that, and then all of the the turmoil and controversy over the big brawl that happened afterwards.
Yeah.
Oh man, it's crazy.
Yeah, I didn't want to stay up that late. I was shockingly able to avoid spoilers and pull up a video of the fight Sunday morning. So I was just like, my heart rate, like watching it was like, oh damn, it was pretty crazy.
Yeah, I hadn't even I wasn't able to get any of it. I was been just working and prepping for this seminar coming up, and my boyfriend came home and told me about it, and I was like, oh, like, how do you lose? And he said, rear naked choke, and I was like, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think he would have let go of that ref and ripped his hands off. That looked pretty bad.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So going a little more into your specialty here, nowadays everybody talks about leaky gut, and everybody seems to have a leaky gut. So specifically, what do we mean? And are we actually seeing more cases of that, or are people just talking about it more?
Well, just like as our ability to sort of diagnose and identify disease states and pathology that develops over time, we're going to see an increase in cases. That being said, do we actually have increased leaky gut? That's hard to say. A lot of people are self-diagnosing or assuming that other maladies are due to leaky gut. We can identify markers of increased gut permeability, and we can measure it indirectly in a clinical setting. But just to say, I have eczema, so I must have leaky gut, or I have gastric upset, so I have leaky gut. That's not a way to actually identify the presence of leaky gut. And what leaky gut refers to, this is a phrase that was coined some years ago by Gummison, who's one of the researchers in the field. So, at one point, I think it was more of a legitimate term, and it's been sort of abused. But it really refers to increased permeability or increased leakage or movement of substances from inside the lumen of the intestine into circulation. So the small and large intestine are lined with these sort of rectangular cylindrical epithelial cells, and these are our absorptive cells. They do other things too aside from absorbing things, but basically that serves as sort of a barrier, because even though people think like the insides of our stomachs and intestines are inside the body, technically that's actually external to the body. And
Right.
so these cells express immune receptors that help fend off pathogens, because that's external to the body. You can think of it sort of like, I've called it like a poopy moat before, like around a castle. So these cells are the wall of that castle, and they're held together by tight junction proteins. And ideally, you want them to be really tight together so that you don't have movement of potentially pathogenic substances, between those cells and into circulation or into the connective tissue that supports those cells. So if you have a leaky gut, or I like to use the term intestinal permeability because I think it just sounds a little bit more legitimate.
Yeah.
If you have intestinal permeability, then that's been characterized mostly by leakage of lipopolysaccharide, or LPS, which is a toxin that comes from the cell wall of gram-negative bacteria, so specific bacteria that are going to be found in the gut. That can then bind to immune receptors and cause an inflammatory response. And those immune receptors are expressed on all sorts of different tissues. So you can find them on skeletal muscle, and that was something that we had looked at when I was doing my PhD, and that was really how I got into what's going on in the gut, because we were dosing mice with LPS, and I wanted to know, why do I have to get up so early in the morning and inject these mice with LPS? Because it causes an inflammatory cascade. And where does it come from? It comes from the gut. And then I started to question, well, what is going on in the gut then that's leading people with obesity or type 2 diabetes or people who are eating a high-fat diet to have increased LPS leakage and then increased inflammatory tone.
Okay.
That's the longest leaky gut.
Well, you mentioned, with the high-fat diet, and I know that we've seen that higher fat diets do lead to higher levels of LPS. Is that, usually, and you've mentioned this before, how high fat is usually also high carbs and high sugar. So what about when it's just high fat, like a ketogenic diet, or even maybe not specifically ketogenic, but a lower carb, high fat diet? Do we still see that same LPS?
So we can induce low-grade metabolic endotoxemia by feeding people just basically heavy cream. So yeah, you can still see leakage with just high fat and lower carbohydrate. That being said, that hasn't been replicated quite as much as when we're using a model of a westernized diet. So in rodent models, we usually, when we say a high-fat diet, we mean anywhere from about 40 to 60% calories coming from fat, and a large portion of those are usually from saturated fat as well. And then we also have the addition of refined carbohydrates. So usually, the carbohydrates in these diets are coming from like sucrose. So you could look at it like we're feeding these mice kind of sugar cookie dough to mimic that westernized standard American diet. Now, there have been some studies in humans looking at a ketogenic diet, and even a ketogenic diet with caloric restriction. And we do see a decrease in fecal microbial diversity. That may not be, and I talked about this before in a recent podcast too, that it may not be something that we can then extrapolate exactly to what's going on in the gut, because the fecal biome is actually very different from the gut biome. So in order to see what's going on in the gut, you really have to go and look in the gut. And that's really hard to do with humans. It's very invasive. You're looking at, an endoscopy or colonoscopy to try and scrape out some of the mucosal lining and get into, the actual luminal contents. So we can't, definitively say that what is happening in the feces is representative of what's happening in the gut. So just a caveat there. So, and then in some rodent studies that have used a westernized diet, but with caloric restriction, to match those mice that were exercised, they didn't see quite the same deleterious effects that we see in mice that are fed a westernized diet ad libitum, meaning they can eat as much as they want. So it may not necessarily be just the dietary fat alone, but the dietary fat along with obesity and or a sedentary lifestyle. And I've said this many times, I'm not a dogmatic person, so aside from basically, supporting the idea of eating a lot of plants, I think that if a person did a ketogenic diet that was higher in fat, perhaps the addition of plenty of sources of fiber could help reduce the negative effects, because it really looks like dietary fiber is one of the deciding factors in the profile of gut bacteria that we see, and dietary protein as well. But it's difficult because the way that we study the biome it varies from study to study. How deeply are we sampling these fecal samples, and what methods are we using to identify what bacteria are present, and then are we looking at it just from a form standpoint, who's there, versus a function standpoint, what are they doing? And I think we're moving more towards functionality, which is great, but thus far it's been a lot of just, okay, knock on the door, who's there? All right, oh, we've got a lot of Prevotella. And then, it's open also to the debate of what is considered a beneficial versus harmful bacteria. So I've seen examples where people cite, a reduction in lactobacillus is good, or a reduction in lactospiraceae is good. And then other studies would say that that's bad because those are butyrate producers. So butyrate is considered to be beneficial. So, even though, we certainly know that leakage of LPS into circulation can be problematic and causes inflammation, I don't think we can definitively say that this certain diet is going to cause that and be much worse.
Okay.
So yeah, it's just, there are so many caveats to this because it's we really don't know that well. So I don't want, it to be a concern about eating a high fat diet if it's, very nutrient dense, might not be so much of a problem, and just realizing that, like you said, when we talk about a high fat diet in research, it's usually mimicking a westernized high fat diet that comes with plenty of refined carbohydrates. Because I get that question a lot, that people are like, well, what if I'm eating, a lot of salmon and avocado and things like that? That being said, most people are not eating those types of foods, and you can even see when people decide to do, a ketogenic diet, sometimes their version may not be very nutrient dense if they're, relying on a lot of kind of, I don't want to demonize, fast food that can fit into a diet, but, eating a bunless cheeseburger is probably not the most prudent option if it's going to be a staple of your diet.
Sure. And as far as the fiber adding to the microbiome or the diversity, have you seen, almost everybody seems to agree that high amounts of fruits and vegetables is a good thing. There is a small camp that doesn't really follow that. And of course, people talk about the carnivore diet now. But even before all that, I've seen people talk about, even a few doctors say how, when you're looking at lectins and other things like that, they're in plants to protect them from being eaten, and that they are irritants then to some people. And you talk about people saying lectin sensitivity and things like that. Any thoughts on that?
There have been some in vitro studies that have shown increased immune activity in response to some of these compounds. So one example would be in wheat. There's a specific trypsinase, I think, that may cause an immune response, and there's a theory that maybe that's causing people's issues rather than gluten. If gluten sensitivity exists. So I think we have to be cautious though about how we extrapolate that to a human model into the actual gut, because it's very different if we're looking at, just intestinal cells in a petri dish versus the intestinal cells in the ecosystem of the human microbiome. So taking that into consideration, the other thing is most of this can be reduced just by properly processing these foods. So if you're thoroughly cooking the beans, if you are, even some people like are sprouting them and things like that, but thoroughly cooking them, or thoroughly soaking them beforehand, that usually reduces any sort of issues that you might have from some of those, anti-nutrients. And the actual, like, if you look into, cases of people who've had issues from these, it's usually because they're like subsisting entirely on lentils.
Right.
And so I think people really, it's kind of funny because it's like, it's not terribly complicated to eat a nutritious diet. And, there's so much evidence to say, like, eat a plant-centric diet, eat plenty of vegetables and fruits and whole grains. But it's kind of sexier to say, like, oh, there's danger in that, and, maybe you shouldn't do that. Maybe that's causing you to not be able to lose weight, because we kind of want to find these reasons for why it's difficult to lose weight. It's difficult to lose weight because we have evolved to maintain as much body fat as possible, just in case there's a famine.
Right.
So it is. It's a challenge to lose weight, and it's supposed to be. And it's probably not because you're eating, too many fruits and vegetables. When you say that out loud, like, oh, clearly my diet is too high in vegetables. No,
Right.
Just not a lot of logic there. So that being said, there are specific fibers that are found in fruits, vegetables, dairy, that are readily fermentable, and in some cases they can be fermented to the point that it causes a lot of gas and bloating. The buildup of gas can actually mess with transit times, so you may have constipation, and in that case, then it's prudent to just limit those fruits and vegetables and dairy products that would contain those fibers that cause those issues. And this is something that I've touched on quite a lot, the low FODMAP diet.
Right.
I've actually recommended it for clients, not across the board, but I've had some people come to me that have really, really severe bloating. And it's just a well-organized elimination diet that allows you to systematically remove foods that are known to be triggers for these issues, and then gradually introduce them back in. So you don't want to live on that type of restrictive diet forever. You want to get an idea of what exactly it is that's causing you to have those issues, and then eat everything else except those things. So like you can still have a really very nutritious diet if you can't, for example, eat like spinach and asparagus.
Right.
And so that's okay. So yeah, it's not to say that, people won't have issues from some of these foods. They certainly can, but it's probably not so much, those anti-nutrients. It's probably just fiber being fermented.
Do you see a health problem when that happens, or is it just more discomfort when people are having, the high FODMAP foods?
If it's causing someone to have, well, it certainly, quality of life is a health issue. So if they are feeling that, they can't exercise, or, I had one that couldn't use their belt, like while lifting, it was very uncomfortable. Feeling very self-conscious, feeling uncomfortable. So even just from a quality of life standpoint, I would say it's a health issue just psychologically. In terms of physiologically, more on the side of, if a person is having chronic diarrhea from those foods, you have a few different issues. You're not having sufficient time to absorb and utilize the nutrients from your food. Your bacteria, likewise, won't have quite as much time to utilize nutrients from that food. So it may predispose you to have, the growth of more rapid bacterial growers. So you could have, maybe blooms of more pathogenic bacteria because you have a dysbiosis there. That's basically a non-beneficial profile of gut bacteria. Okay. Just like we can have dyslipidemia, you can have dysbiosis.
Right.
So that could be an issue. Also, obviously, dehydration would be a concern there as well. So, and, you know, if it's constipation, that can lead to obviously, you know, a lot of discomfort. And, you know, even an impacted bowel, that can be life threatening. So on either extreme, you know, either end of the extreme spectrum, that could certainly be a serious issue. And if it's just, you know, if it's the chronic bloating and things like that, it becomes really more of a quality of life issue, which I still think, you know, needs to be addressed, because a lot of these people sort of resign themselves to it, or they're embarrassed to say anything about it, and,
Sure.
or, you know, it just becomes normal. I mean, if you live with something for years, that becomes a normal part of your life. Or, you know, they receive sort of the generic recommendation of increasing fiber or supplementing with probiotics, and those things can actually exacerbate gas production. So, you know, I think it's something that needs to be treated with more, it's just more of a nuanced issue than just saying, like, you know, take fiber, add a supplement.
Right, right. In those elimination diets, are you eventually focusing on trying to bring back foods that might have not initially been tolerated?
Well, it's more about bringing in foods to see if they will be tolerated. So
Okay.
instead of like throwing a bunch, take probiotics and digestive enzymes and these vitamins and minerals and things like that will heal your gut, which is not a claim that should even be made. The idea is, okay, let's eliminate these foods that have pretty consistently shown to cause gas and bloating and gastric upset. See how you feel for a few weeks. In most cases, especially with people who have irritable bowel syndrome, they do see a reduction in things like bloating and gas and gastric upset. And then it's just, you know, okay, pick one food. So it's time consuming, it's an investment, but you pick one food that you want to introduce, and then you monitor your symptoms for a few days. And if things are okay, you don't have any bloating or anything like that, well, that food wasn't an issue, and so you can keep that in, and then you move on to the next one. And then if you do see that you suddenly experience symptoms, then the food that you reintroduce is probably a trigger. But the trick is, you know, keeping everything else consistent, which can be a challenge, because, you know, maybe if you're eating food that you haven't prepared, you don't know exactly what the ingredients are, or even, you know, exercise can cause gastric upset, you know, even sleep disturbances and things like that.
Yeah, I like that you touched on the wait in a few days, because people don't do the same thing every single day, and you know, they're used to changing foods around. And I've gone through an elimination diet and just adding things slowly back at like one at a time, and it's very tedious. If you can get through it, it's great, but it's exceptionally tedious, especially if you're not trying to mess around with supplements that might affect it and anything else. And then if training, like you said, training can exacerbate things sometimes, so it can be tough. But on the whole world, I think, like we said before, we see that increased biodiversity is generally a good thing. When we're taking probiotics, the research I've seen seems to indicate that once the probiotics are stopped, they're not often found in the gut anymore. Is that so? You know, why is that? Why don't they stick around? And does that mean we have to just take the probiotics for life?
Well, you know, it's really interesting now. There are a couple new studies that have just come out on probiotic supplementation, and they're really the most invasive and insightful that I've seen so far. We can very easily in rodents, if you give them a probiotic supplementation, you can then, after sacrificing them, look at exactly what's going on in the gut. But like I mentioned, with humans, that's not so easy. And so what we usually rely on, in you know, 9 times out of 10, we're looking at fecal samples in human participants who are taking probiotics. So we make a couple of assumptions there. One, we assume that those probiotics are taking up residence in the large intestine, which is where we really want them, especially those bifidobacterium. And we also assume that they're taking up residence at all. We assume that because we see them that they're present in feces, that they're then going to be present in the gut. But that looks like that's actually not the case. So in a couple of studies that have come out from overlapping researchers, they actually found that it's likely that individuals may be resistant to probiotics, and then some may be permissive to probiotics, with no change in probiotic shedding in the feces. So that means whether or not you are going to be enriched by those probiotics, you'll be shedding them in your feces in the same amount. So
Oh, wow.
so we assume seeing them in the feces that they're enriching the gut, and that may not actually be the case. And it also, and just like people can be more receptive or not to probiotic enrichment, kind of the lasting effects on the gut vary as well. One thing that I used to recommend was to take a probiotic while or after taking an antibiotic, because antibiotics can certainly reduce diversity and have a lasting effect on the gut as well. But once again, when I see really solid evidence, I tend to change my mind. And this was really solid, in my opinion, because not only did they look at, what was going on in the feces, they actually did take samples from the lumen and the mucosa throughout the digestive tract of these participants. Oh, wow. Yeah. So from stomach all the way to rectum, they looked at what was going on. And they found that probiotic supplementation, even though those probiotics enriched the gut, it was a little bit easier after the antibiotics had, kind of wiped things out. That the people who were taking the probiotics actually did not return to their native microbiome even months afterwards. And so they actually experienced, when we think of dysbiosis, we often think about an overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria, but that's not necessarily the case. Dysbiosis can also be just a loss of the beneficial bacteria. We can also interpret it as just a reduction in diversity. So these people had high levels of those beneficial probiotic strains, but then that was about it. So their native biome didn't return. They found better, a more rapid return in people who either had an autologous fecal transplant, so they ingested their own fecal transplant, or people who just went back to doing their normal things, just watch and wait, So, but it depends on what your native biome was. So, if we're looking at healthy people, we want them to return back to their normal biome after an antibiotic dose. If we're looking at people who have an inflammatory bowel disease, we don't necessarily need them to return to their native biome. So it's just, it's one study, or two studies rather, but I think that it really, and then there was a third one, I forgot to mention this, that a lot of people talked about, but it was associating SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, with probiotic supplementation. And it kind of illustrated that perhaps even though they did take samples, but we haven't looked at this in really other probiotic studies, but perhaps these probiotic bacteria were taking up residence then in the small intestine instead, and that's not really where we need them to be.
Right.
So probiotic supplementation, I've said this since the beginning, that isn't necessarily like the best option for every person. Especially, I think it's sort of strange to recommend that for a person who may have dysbiosis related to too many quote unquote beneficial bacteria. We don't necessarily need to be adding more. And instead, making changes through diet. But you're right that it looks like it is pretty transient. And so we see enrichment of probiotic strains while we're ingesting probiotics. And then afterwards, things pretty much go back to normal. And that's really what we see, with diet as well. We see changes associated with diet. And when the diet changes, so does the biome. And that can happen in as little as 24 hours. So those bacteria, because they're, competing for space and nutrients and whatnot, we don't often look at the interaction between those bacteria themselves. We look at, what's the interaction between diet and the biome, or exercise in the biome, or obesity in the biome. But it's important to look at, how are these bacteria affecting one another? Like, do we see an inverse correlation between certain strains and others as they outcompete each other? So.
Right. So you said you used to recommend probiotics after antibiotics, but now, basically you're just saying go to a healthy diet is the best recommendation after a course of antibiotics?
Yeah, now I would say, it may be better if you were a healthy person before, and you just took antibiotics because you had, some bronchial infection or something like that. You were
Right.
treating a bacterial infection with antibiotics, but you were, a healthy person before and you eat a nutritious diet and you exercise. It's probably fine to just go back to what you were doing before and your biome will recover. Um, and if that's not the case, then maybe it's warranted. But once again, it's hard to say like where they're going to end up. Are you really going to be enriched in them, enriched by them? And it's there's not really a way to tell because it seems like the way that some of the correlates that they found with people who were receptive or permissive were pretty much all genes being expressed in the cecum. So it's sort of where the small intestine and the large intestine meet. It's like a
Yeah.
little pothole. Things get stuck in there and bacteria develop and grow from there. And, we can't really just go in and check everyone's cecum and see what genes are being expressed there. And then
Right.
the other thing is, that not all probiotics are going to be created equally. You have to make sure that you're looking for one that has, a USP label for purity, USP, NSF, GMP. These are all for like third-party labels that indicate, yes, this product contains what it says it contains. And so that's another thing to think about, that it's going to be a monetary investment and there has to be good justification for using it, and that even if you do use it, once you stop using it, those probiotic strains likely will not be continuously enriched in your gut.
Have you seen, have you actually noticed either in yourself or people you work with significant benefits from taking probiotics? Because there seems to be a huge range.
Mm-hmm.
And I've taken, and we can talk about the VSL3 in a bit, but I've taken that many times. I never noticed anything. I've taken over the counter, and I've actually made my own yogurt
Oh,
several
cool.
times.
Yeah.
I've tried it with regular milk and goat's milk, and every time I either notice nothing or a worsening of symptoms. So unfortunately, while I love the concept, I haven't responded well at all.
Yeah, I have not taken probiotics for many, many years. I did when, my doctoral studies, that was, we used VSL3. And I thought, based on what we had seen in rodents and in humans then for IBS, I thought maybe it would be beneficial. Because I was diagnosed with IBS back when I was in grad school early. And it was really, it could have been IBS, but it could have also been that I was an endurance athlete at the time, and endurance exercise itself can cause severe gastric upset, especially when you're not fueling properly, which I wasn't at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I did try to take probiotics back then, and I actually found the same. I actually experienced just more bloating and more gas, and so I thought, well, this doesn't really seem to be helping anything.
Yeah.
And I find that I've done the same thing. I've done elimination diets as well, and I've been able to identify a few of the foods that seem to cause me the most gastric upset, and I just don't eat those. And that has been a huge benefit. I mean, that I can tell, like, if asparagus and spinach, those are what I had mentioned earlier, because like those are two foods I know that I cannot digest.
Yeah.
And so I just avoid those, and I don't have to buy anything,
Yeah. That's
and
funny because those are the two that I have found that I do tolerate.
really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So.
Well, you're lucky. I do. I miss asparagus and spinach. I love salads, so now I've got to go. It seems that iceberg isn't so bad, so everyone hates on it, but hey, I get it. I like salad. But I haven't had too many clients come to me on probiotics already. Just a few. And they said that they hadn't really noticed any benefit. And when I recommended, okay, well, let's stop the supplements for now and just focus on, eliminating foods first, they felt fine just, going on that baseline low FODMAP diet and not having probiotics. But, based on the literature, it does look like they're beneficial for reducing symptoms, especially of IBS, in terms of, chronic constipation or diarrhea. So it may be beneficial in that respect for, self-reported markers of gastric upset.
Sure. Yeah, like I said, it seems to be a huge variability there. I'm like in a Facebook group, and a lot of people are making their own yogurt and stuff like that too. And some people swear by it. They say it was like the thing that, got them over the hump, and now they're feeling great. I don't know it would be interesting if we could find out why we respond one way versus another and see like, who responds best. But I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, some people, like that study had shown, some people are receptive and some people are not. So perhaps there are people who are being enriched. And I think it also depends on whether your issues are due to an increase in pathogenic or harmful bacteria or a decrease in the beneficial bacteria. Because we don't have one specific profile for dysbiosis. We know that it's like the wrong numbers of bacteria, relatively speaking.
Right.
Because we need to have a balance. We need to have some pathogenic bacteria. The biome educates and helps to mature our immune system. So, we need to have like the balance of good and evil. But, if something happens in your life or with your diet that knocks that, to skew it in one way or another, where you're killing off the beneficial or having an overgrowth of the pathogenic, that's where you would really have issues. So if you are enriching, if you had a lack of beneficial and maybe the probiotics are helping, then, that might explain why a person could have, better benefits than others, just like people react differently to drugs because they're metabolized, partially by those bacteria, and so that can even predispose us to, whether or not we're going to respond to a actual pharmaceutical treatment.
Have you seen literature suggesting probiotic benefits for IBD? Because most of what I've seen has been in IBS, not too much in IBD. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it does seem to help. Once again, more with. It may reduce markers of inflammation, so that's one thing. And then in sort of just symptom severity and, the number of flare-ups. So they do seem to be beneficial for whether we're talking about irritable bowel syndrome or an inflammatory bowel disease. Mostly, and looking at really more of the multi-strain probiotics. So it looks like the most effective probiotics we find, like VSL as an example, they have multiple strains. They're extremely potent, and so that is there's a greater chance there of enrichment, because when you think about it, we're looking at hundreds of trillions of bacteria in the gut.
Right.
So if you take 1 million acidophilus, that's going to be like a drop in the ocean. So that's what I've seen thus far. That we need to it needs to be sufficiently dosed, and those are usually kind of the expensive ones too.
Right.
But I think if that's something that you want to experiment with, it's worth making the investment in the really high quality probiotics that are at least but most of them are much higher than this, but more than 1 billion colony forming units. But most of them are 10 or 50. I mean they've gotten much more potent in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, if anybody is interested in making their own, I don't know if you've looked into this at all, but there's some places you can just get just nothing except the probiotics themselves. I used custom probiotics, and you just use a very, very small amount, but you use that as like a culture starter. And then that will make a whole thing of, yogurt probably like this big, which has billions and billions of bacteria there. So it's kind of a pain in the ass to make it, but it'll save money in the long run.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So you talked about, a few times the endurance athletes having some gut issues there. And that is something, because I've had people tell me one is a cyclist, another person is a distance runner. And when I first heard about it being a problem, I was like, no, exercise is great and it causes, an overall decrease in inflammation, like long term. But it seems to be the case that can happen. So why is that?
Oh yeah, and it was funny, I even did just a little survey on Instagram, because I read that, even up to 90% of endurance athletes, especially, but up to about 60% of any type of athlete has experienced some form of gastric upset. And I got about that number on Instagram, my survey of 300 Instagrammers. But yeah, about 60% of them said that they'd experienced some gastric upset. seems to be more prevalent in endurance athletes and females, and especially is associated with heat or psychological stress. So even if we're looking at people who may not be athletes, but are, doing like a military exercise, they can experience increased gut permeability, even without the athletic side of things. It's just being highly physically active in a really stressful environment seems to increase gut permeability. So there are a few different theories as to why that is. There's obviously mechanical trauma that's occurring in the gut, so there's a lot of jostling going on. Exercise increases or speeds transit time, so the foodstuffs are moving very rapidly through the intestines, which is obviously going to be increasing friction and then decreasing the time that bacteria have with those nutrients. Then you also have shunting of blood flow away from the intestines into the skeletal muscle, to the working muscle. And so we have reduced blood flow and reduced oxygen availability. And so that just kind of changes the metabolic environment for those bacteria. So some bacteria, well, all bacteria can readily ferment, carbohydrates or they can ferment in an anaerobic environment. That's fine. And then some of them are facultative anaerobes, so they can do things with oxygen as well, and so they can flip back and forth. But you could, by changing both oxygen availability and pH, be supporting the growth of specific bacteria over others that may not be as happy in an acidic environment. And we see that even as we're going from stomach to the large intestine, both diversity and overall numbers of bacteria increase because we have decreased acidity. So those are some of the theories behind why we might see some gastric upset, because basically, we have lack of blood flow there, we have lack of oxygen. We do see that there aren't so much there's very limited literature, I'll say, about this too.
Yeah.
But looking at like the acute effects of exercise, it looks like we don't see so much a change in the bacteria themselves, but perhaps a change in their function and their gene expression. So it looks like they don't focus so much on energy production for themselves, but flagellar assembly and chemotaxis. So I almost envision them like, are they trying to like hang on? They're like, everything's moving around so much, hang on and try to hold on for dear life. But there's just not a lot known about that. And once again, we're looking at the feces of these individuals rather than what's going on actually in the gut.
Right.
So those things can all change the environment inside the gut. And then, but you were right that over time, when we look at the chronic effects of exercise, that we do see decreased markers of inflammation, and we see overall an increase in diversity in the gut, and we see an increase. Really, what I'm seeing, I've been looking for trends because we're so different in how we're studying these bacteria, but I'm trying to find what's common between a lot of these studies, and it looks like it's the increase in butyrate producers. So butyrate is a short-chain fatty acid that's produced via fermentation of fiber. And that's very beneficial for gut health and may actually be helpful in increasing insulin sensitivity as well. And now, that being said, it's not necessarily just a factor of exercise. It could be also a dietary thing too, because most endurance athletes are eating a diet that's high in carbohydrate and high in fiber intake. So it's hard to parse out, the effect of exercise alone versus the effect of exercise versus diet. And once again, like I said, there are so few studies on this, and everything really has been done in endurance athletes. So we've got a couple studies that were done in the rugby players. I think a lot of people are familiar with that. Cyclists and so amateur marathoners. There have been a couple that have looked at just healthy people who are sedentary, but stratifying them by cardiovascular fitness level, and then looking at how that is related to diversity. So it does look like there's a link between cardiovascular fitness and diversity. but, it's sort of a chicken egg thing,
Right.
do you have better cardiovascular fitness, because of your diversity or vice versa? Now in resistance training, there's nothing really. I've been able to find 2 studies, and if people have other studies, please send them to me because I'm having a hard time finding stuff. But it just doesn't look like it's really an area that's been explored yet. And
what did they find?
This was there was a study done on overweight and obese women who did curves, which is it's kind of an old, I don't know if it's even around anymore, but it was an interval style resistance training program. And they found that they had reduced endotoxin levels, but they didn't have any they didn't measure the microbiome specifically. Now these women also lost weight, and so it could be a factor of weight. There was another study that used both resistance training and aerobic exercise training as well. And I want to say that it was a 3 time per week intervention. And we couldn't parse out what was the effect of aerobic exercise versus resistance training. Those people also lost some weight, and they also were supplemented with whey proteins. There were a lot of variables going on, and they found no change in the fecal biome. But it also depends on sort of the sensitivity of the test that you're using and how many samples you take and how deeply you sequence that to identify who's there. That being said, they just looked at, changes in the profile of what bacteria would be present. They didn't necessarily look at changes in function. Sometimes, and there was a really interesting study, something that doesn't get talked a lot about in the cyclist study was that they actually found increased activity of a specific archaea. So archaea, they're a different group from bacteria. They're kind of similar to bacteria, but this organism consumes hydrogen, it produces methane, and that can actually help increase the efficiency of fermentation in the gut. And so even though 99% of what's in our gut are bacteria, so there are very low levels of other things like viruses and archaea, the activity of those organisms can be very high. And so it's important to look at not just who's there, but what they're doing. Because you can have bacteria that may be at fairly low levels, but their transcriptive, the transcription of their genes into proteins actually doing something can be extremely high. And so you can see functional changes without profile changes. So where I mentioned, that we don't see an acute change, well, this was a study done in marathoners, and they studied the profile, who's there before and after a race, and really didn't find any changes. And from there we could say, oh, well, acute exercise has no effect on the gut. But we actually found that there was a functional change there. And so functional changes may actually be, something even more important to look at than just who's there. We need to know what the gut is actually doing rather than just who's living in it. Because, we have back when this research was still sort of emerging in the olden days. I don't know, now it's almost 10 years ago. I'm so old. But when I was, just starting to study this in grad school, they characterized an obesogenic microbiome as one that was high in Firmicutes. And so they would say too many Firmicutes and too few Bacteroidetes. That's the problem. Well, the Firmicutes groups contains a lot of beneficial bacteria. Lactobacillus is part of the Firmicutes group. So comparing the Firmicutes to a Bacteroidetes is sort of like saying vertebrates compared to invertebrates.
Yeah.
If you were an alien looking at Earth and you said vertebrates seem to be contributing to pollution on that planet more so than invertebrates, that does not tell you really much of anything. I mean, vertebrates, you mean your house cat? So that was so general, but that's really what the body of literature said. And now, because we've had so many rapid developments in how sensitively and how specifically we can identify bacteria, we know that, that ratio, even though it's something that people still use as a metric, that's really not telling us the whole story. And now seeing that even looking at specific strains of bacteria. Now we can get as specific as the species level, even though there's not really technically a bacterial species definition, but we can get very specific and see who's there. We also need to see what they're doing. And also, realizing that because we get so much data out of the gut, I mean, we're looking at thousands of species. Sometimes we have to remove these species that are really low in abundance and assume that they are not playing an important role because they're so low in abundance. But that may not be the case. We may actually just be overlooking things. So even though, we see a few of these similar names in these exercise studies, Prevotella was big, Akkermansia, Rotharia, these names come up a lot, but it doesn't mean that there aren't other microbes out there that could be really beneficial and important. We just haven't seen them yet. And so this area of research is absolutely still in its early infancy. And I think then, if I have the opportunity to get back into, doing more research and academia or collaborating, I think the area of resistance training in the microbiome absolutely needs more attention. We just don't know.
Very interesting stuff. Yeah, I actually noticed, and my theory is because it kind of directed blood flow away from the gut. But I noticed when I was feeling my worst probably, and I was having really bad cramps numerous times a day, one of the only times that didn't happen was when I was working out. Yeah. And my thought was maybe, lack of peristalsis and everything because the blood flows away. That's the only thing I could really think of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we do see differences too it's sort of like a dose response. More intense exercise is going to likely cause more issues, like triathletes, people who are exercising intensely for long periods of time will actually see increased gut permeability. Whereas if we're looking at people who are doing just, lower levels of exercise, less than 60% VO2 max doesn't seem to cause those same changes in the gut. And if we compare mice who are voluntary wheel runners versus mice who are on forced treadmill running, usually the voluntary wheel runners seem to reap more benefits in some cases, than the forced treadmill running. That being said, forced treadmill running for a mouse is arguably probably more stressful than forced treadmill running for a human.
Right.
Because they don't know what's going on, and they're like, this giant hand keeps touching me. But, just something to think about, that there's definitely a dose-dependent response, and we're really in the midst of sort of this push for more is better and work out until you barf and stuff like that. That's not necessarily the case. More is just more, and it's important to properly periodize your training.
So for people who are having some gut issues, at this point, I guess the main recommendation is just don't do a ton of endurance exercise
Yeah, I wouldn't want to say if someone is really in love with doing triathlons and things like that, it's not so much that, you have to stop, but ensuring that you're properly hydrated and that your carbohydrate beverage, because this actually has been shown to help reduce, markers of inflammation and gut permeability, but taking in a proper concentration of carbohydrates, so going for that 6 to 8% concentration of carbs. There are not a lot of studies on probiotic interventions, but in the couple that I've seen, it looks like chronic, meaning, a week, as far as the study goes. But chronic supplementation may reduce markers of intestinal permeability. But really what we've seen more often is not so much intervention, it's just we test people, after they do something strenuous and find that they have increased levels of lipopolysaccharide. But, just like during endurance exercise, you're also going to have increased production of free radicals. And that doesn't mean that these people are necessarily at increased risk of cancers and things like that, like we see in people who have increased free radical production from obesity or overeating. In response to the increased free radical production, in response to oxidative stress, their antioxidant systems are enriched. And so, just like we can detoxify LPS, like our liver is, the one secret doctors don't want you to know, having a liver, you don't need to detox because you process those things. So, the presence of elevated LPS in a person who is extremely physically fit doesn't necessarily indicate a problem, but it does correlate strongly with the presence of gastric upset. So more often the people who experience really significant gastric upset or need some sort of medical intervention usually also have higher circulating endotoxin levels as well.
Awesome.
So yeah, just rest properly, proper nutrition and fueling. Those seem to be the biggest things.
Okay, cool. And as far as I guess enhancing our microbiome as much as possible, if possible, what are some of the things that we can eat to try to do that to maybe give us a better defense when these inevitable stressful situations arise in life?
Mm-hmm. Well, some of the strongest correlates with these beneficial butyrate producers appear to be, and I've stressed this so many times, fiber
Yeah.
and carbohydrate content in the diet. Protein also seems to dictate pretty strongly different type of beta diversity, which is basically when we look at two different people's biomes and how similar or how different are they. Protein intake can also dictate your diversity compared to another person. So if your dietary protein and carbohydrate intake are very different, and really fat intake as well. So macronutrient content of the diet will have an effect on the diversity of your microbiome. Generally speaking, if you have a really high protein diet, you probably will have higher levels of Bacteroides, they're mucin degraders, and that has been linked to increased risk of the production of some harmful metabolites and perhaps a reduction in the mucus layer of the intestine. That being said, a high protein diet has been linked to tons of health benefits and improvements in body composition. So I think that probably the biggest factor that would be most beneficial and protective would be, regardless of how you want the rest of your diet to look, ensuring that you're getting sufficient fiber, I think would be the biggest benefit. And so for women, that's about 25 grams a day. For men, that's about 38 grams per day, or you're going for about 14 grams per 1,000 calories that you're eating. The ceiling to fiber, because of course you can have too much of anything, looks like it's about 70 grams per day. And at that point, you're probably going to have more gastric upset. It's not going to benefit you anymore. And, you do need to make sure that you're not, promoting the growth of just like one specific strain of bacteria either. We need to make sure that there's a balance there. And so because a varied diet, will support a diverse bacteria, have a varied diet. So whether, if you want to be vegetarian, vegan, ketogenic, whatever, you can do that in prudent ways. I would say that, doing something like the carnivore diet probably would be one of the least prudent things you could do. Eliminating any entire food group is probably not going to be the best. So, so plenty of vegetables and fruit and whole grains. I mean, these aren't groundbreaking things. It's just, usually what we see when we look at large scale studies and we're finding these correlations. Westernized diet has been associated with reduced diversity, whereas we look at more of an agrarian diet that's high in complex carbohydrates, there's greater diversity there. So plant-centric is usually what I promote. And then, based on what we consider to be a high-fat diet, it's probably prudent to, and this goes along with, the American Heart Association recommendations, eating a diet that's less than 40% calories from fat, and specifically, really the recommendation is to limit it to 30 to 35% of your calories coming from fat. And then certainly if you want to include, probiotic containing foods, that's probably, you're not going to get as much of a load of probiotics as you would from taking a probiotic supplement. So eating fermented foods would be another way, to support the health of your gut. And then if you do end up having to take an antibiotic, because that's, that happens, you have an infection, or it can be something that you do, as a preventative mechanism, to complete the whole series of antibiotics. Don't stop early because you're feeling better or something like that. Go ahead and take them all the way through. And then, if you're a healthy person, go back to the healthy things that you were doing before. If we abuse antibiotics, that really is what leads to, the development of antibiotic resistant
Right.
bacteria, and that can be really problematic. So, and then, like I had mentioned with exercise, there's a dose-dependent response there. So making sure that you're periodizing exercise properly and you're not running yourself into the ground and just chasing volume and, more for the sake of more. Do it in a planned way and really prioritize recovery and try to reduce your stress levels as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, actually, there's some interesting new research on the antibiotic prescriptions. I know when I was originally learning how to prescribe, and like you said, it was always make sure they take all of it and, this amount of time. And I've seen actually that's being questioned a little bit now, depending on the reason that it's being prescribed. Like if I'm just doing like a basic procedure, it used to be full week of amoxicillin, and now we're talking about maybe like 3 or 4 days. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, like I said, newer research, but on the whole, yeah, I would agree. Whatever your doctor is telling you, just complete the course.
Yes, exactly. That's what I stress. Just do what your doctor tells you. If your doctor tells you to do fewer days, do fewer days. But yeah, the idea that like we really stress that, or folks will really stress that it's like, oh, well, you're overusing them in agriculture and things like that. And that could be an issue, but there's certainly also the issue of, people not using their antibiotics properly.
Sure.
Or it's like there's two camps of, I guess, we're using them too much and then people who, want to go and like roll in dirt and things like that and eat dirt. So any extreme probably, isn't the best. And if people are curious about whether, you want to be eating dirt and things like that, there is a different environmental biome than there is to the gut biome. And so there is a thing now, this is the trend of like, wanting to eat dirt related microbes. And certainly exposure to the environment, animals and things like that, at an early age, that's beneficial. It looks like it reduces the risk of developing allergies later in life. But consuming dirt-related microbes won't necessarily benefit your gut because we have a specific human gut microbiome that is different from our skin biome and our vaginal biome and our oral biome. So not all microbes need to be ingested.
Okay, awesome. So I'm just like looking at the list of topics that I wanted to discuss with you, and I think we could easily double our time here. So, so maybe we'll stop here, and hopefully we can get you back on for a part 2.
Yeah.
We've got a few different things we would want to discuss. So I know you're writing a book, or maybe it's coming out. I don't know when. Could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, so I've written a section for the upcoming RP Diet Book 2.0, and that's going to be coming out at the end of this year. And then next year, I will be writing really a big RP gut health book. And so it's not necessarily going to be like just a diet book. I'm going to find really as much, and communicate as much of the literature as I possibly can on multiple body systems, because we know that the microbiome plays a role in mental health, reproductive health, metabolic health, gut health, really it runs the gamut. So that's going to be my goal next year. So, writing always takes longer than you think it's going to. And I'll be looking to take my RD exam and whatnot early next year too. Okay. So I'm hoping that book is going to be out, by the end of next year, maybe beginning of 2020. But yeah, so those are going to be things to look out for. And in the meantime, I'll be at seminars, this one coming up next weekend, Juggernaut Performance Seminar in Newport Beach in California. And we just announced a seminar in Australia next year. Nice. So yeah, that's going to be really incredible. And that will be in June 2019. So yeah, lots of stuff coming up.
Very cool. Yeah, I think you picked pretty much the perfect time to go into this field, because gut health, as you obviously know, is blown up so much in the last few years. So everybody's going to be seeking you out. Yeah,
and that's great. I'm here to dispel myths, hopefully, and answer questions, maybe burst some bubbles.
So where else can people find you? Your Vitamin PhD on Instagram, right?
Mm-hmm,
Anywhere else?
Yep, I'm Vitamin PhD on Facebook as well.
Okay.
I also have vitaminphdnutrition.com. It's mostly just a blog, and I post like any seminars and podcasts and whatnot. I post the links up there. I don't update the blog as often as I should, but every couple of months, if I have something that's noteworthy there. And then Facebook, I link my Instagram too. And if they want to email me, they can email me at Gabrielle@RenaissancePeriodization.com. And then if they want to go online and look at my website, they can contact me there as well. So I respond to Instagram messages. I really like it when people reach out there. So I try to be, as in touch with everyone as possible.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for talking today.
Thank you so much.
Hey guys, thanks for tuning in for the interview with Dr. Gabrielle Fundaro. This is definitely a favorite topic of mine, so I'm already looking forward to having her on for a part 2. And if you like the Fur Kids charity that we mentioned earlier today, please feel free to make your own donation.